This video is for Chapter 12, which is on work. Um, this video is going to touch on some themes that were discussed in the previous chapter on family, particularly in regards of division of labor in households, although it also introduces some new ideas and concepts as well. So there used to be a real gender divide in regards to work. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with that traditional nuclear family model where the husband, father is the breadwinner, the wage earner, and then the wife and mother is a stay-at-home caretaker. And so in 1900, 1 out of 5 women worked for income. And today, 58% of women do, most of whom are full-time. And it isn't necessarily only women who don't have children or young children, because 60% of women with children under age 3 work, 65% with 3 to 5-year-olds, and 73% of women with children ages 6 to 17. And a little over half of all married couples both are working for income. So although there isn't this clear gender divide anymore between, who is the wage earner and who is not in families, work is still viewed through this real gendered lens because men are expected to work. And therefore, if they are, a failure in the work sphere, they can be what's considered unsexed, that it's unmanly to not be working. It's unmanly to not be successful in the area of work. It's unmanly to not be able to pay your own bills and take care of yourself. Women, although more of them are working, they still very much, at least in society, they are still viewed as this being optional. And, and for some parts of society, it is even seen as being suspicious if women prioritize work over family, if they seem to be more career focused than family focused. And so in this way, it's almost the opposite. Women are unsexed by success. A woman who is very successful in the career arena, particularly if she's single or childless, or even if she's not single and childless, there are concerns about, is she a good mother who's taking care of her children? The types of questions that we oftentimes don't ask about working fathers. So it's not necessarily seen as feminine to be overly career-oriented, overly successful, and it's not seen as, it's seen as being non-masculine or unmasculine if you are a man and you're not successful in this area. Okay, I took a short pause there so I could turn off some notifications. So this gendered kind of ideology around work still exists, even though the empirical evidence suggests that it should not. And of course, if you're looking at it by states, the states do vary in terms of labor force participation. Sometimes people are very surprised that, in California, that is actually one of the states where there are less women in the workforce than average, and as well as most of the South. Probably in the South, of course, it probably has a lot to do with religious and cultural ideologies that are more likely to still promote this traditional household with this strict kind of separate spheres, where men are the wage earners and women are it meets with greater social approval to stay at home. In California, you definitely still probably have, people that are influenced by religion and traditional ideologies, but also just kind of given the number of wealthy people in California, especially some of the big cities, you can just imagine that there might be more households in that state where people can just afford to not have both people working. And then you can see that, states, a lot of the mountain states have the most women in the workforce. So, I think this is an interesting map, because it maybe is illustrating trends that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So why is it important that women work? certainly, for a lot of households, it's a necessity. The households will be more financially stable if both adults in the household, if they have two adults, that they're both working. If you take a step back and look at it on a more macro level, there is a link between a nation's economic growth and the rates of women's employment. Nations that have high rates of women's employment are usually stronger in most measures related to the economy. Now, the thing is these women who are not working aren't necessarily not working, because not all labor is counted as being official labor, official work. And so women in particular dominate what's called the informal labor sector. So this is, you're working, but you're working in the type of capacity that is not recognized by the government, right? You haven't registered yourself as a small business. You're not paying taxes on what you earn. And so in the eyes of the government, you aren't working, even though, you might be working, full time, but it's, so-called under the table work in the informal labor sector. And so this could be things like agricultural work. This could be things like selling goods at the market. If you're keeping children in your home, unlicensed daycare. If you're doing hair or nails or brows, but you don't have a license, but yet you regularly have clientele and this is how you're earning a living, all of that's informal labor sector. Men, of course, do work in the informal labor sector. They could be doing things like working on cars or types of or lawn services. And if they're not registered as a business and paying taxes, they too are part of the informal labor sector. But they are less likely to be solely in that sector, and they are more likely to be part of the formal paid labor force, meaning their labor is being taxed. They're getting regular wages and regular salaries, and thus they're being officially counted in the statistics that we use when we talk about labor force participation. And so, and this, of course, isn't even getting into the fact that, housework is work, childcare, taking care of your children in your home is also work, even if it doesn't meet the definition of what we think of when we use the word work. But it's just worth noting that when I'm talking about women's labor force participation, I am specifically talking about the women who are recognized in the formal paid labor market. And so statistics like this, just kind of keep them in mind. It's measuring formal paid labor participation. And so you can kind of see that, at least 1990 to 2010, and of course in 2010, a lot of countries, including America, were experiencing a bit of an economic downturn. America was coming out of a recession. But you can see for a lot of countries, labor force participation increased for women. And you can see that America is a country, we have a pretty, sizable percentage of women that are in our labor force. There are some countries with a little less. There are some countries with a little more, but we're pretty normative in that regards. And that's despite the fact, like I said, traditionally in this society, femininity has not been associated with the concept of work, paid labor, the way that masculinity has. Historically, work has defined a man's identity. Men are just expected to have jobs. And you can say that to a certain extent, this is still true. This is why there are lagging numbers of men who choose to be stay-at-home fathers and house husbands, and how, in our media, we see people, making jokes about men that pursue that type of path in a way that they don't for women, because it is still seen as being unexpected. And so work status does affect masculinity. And we tend to think that men who are successful at work are generally successful in life. In masculinity studies, this is referred to as being a big wheel, that we send young boys the message that they should aspire to be big wheels, to be financially successful, to be wealthy, to have positions of authority and power. We send them these messages a lot clearly and concretely, more so than we do young girls, right? So the message we send young girls is often, you can be anything you want including, of course, someone that does not have a job in the paid labor force at all. You can be someone who is instead family focused. We don't send that type of message necessarily to young boys. Even today, what we're still pushing is this idea that you're supposed to be powerful and dominant in the economic sphere. And the thing is of course, not all men are big wheels. Like in a capitalist system, they can't be. All of them can't be. And this relates to the idea of compensatory masculinity that was discussed previously in the masculinity chapter. That by not being a big wheel, when a man is financially struggling, when he's unemployed or underemployed, sometimes he feels like he needs to compensate for this kind of loss of masculinity by overdoing masculinity in other ways. And so I found this interesting infographic, and we'll talk more about this later in this presentation. But overwhelmingly, most CEOs are men, and not just men, but certain types of men. And so this is kind of based on a content analysis of, you know, who the current CEOs are. But you can kind of see that they have some qualities, some interesting qualities in common. But maybe the kind of most obvious quality that they have in common is the fact that so many of them, overwhelming number of them, are in fact men. But work is no longer solely the domain of men. Women's labor force participation is increasing, as I've already established, for a lot of families. Both adults are working for some amount of time outside of the home for a wage. And so this is the question that this chapter asks. If women now have equal rights in the workplace, why aren't they as successful as men at work? And so this chapter begins with kind of discussing the changing workplace for women in terms of specific occupations. And so the occupation that they focus on are stewardesses. And so it's worth noting that originally, stewards have been men, and they talked about, especially if you're thinking about on trains and buses, it was men of color, particularly African-American men. But as flying became more of an option, stewards were white men, and they said that that was because, you know, they felt like this was a masculine job, you know, protecting people, you know, in the skies, and that especially for class purposes, they also needed to be white men to be kind of seen as being authority figures. And this was largely the case, of course, until, like so many things, you know, World War II, where you know, men went off to fight in the war, and stewards were replaced by stewardesses. And when it became more common for a woman to have this position than a man, then the expectations and perceptions around it also shifted. You know, now, of course, it was more about female spectacle, sexual objectification, being friendly, being perky, being cute, being attractive, you know, the types of qualities that were not at play when it was men as stewards. And at the same time, there's this shift in perception. There's also this shift in value and pay. And your book talks about this in regards to what they call the androcentric pay scale. Jobs that are dominated by men are paid more. It probably has a lot to do with the fact that men, of course, the male identity, masculinity, is associated more with work. There's the expectation that in a family, a man's supposed to be the breadwinner, a woman is not. So if a job is held by men, then it's going to be a better paying job. And it isn't just, it's not just stewards versus stewardesses that you can kind of see those distinctions between, you know, value and financial compensation and the gender compensation of the occupation. We've talked about this in regards to educators, teachers. You know, we've talked about this in regards to nurses. Your book introduces this concept in regards to other positions, like the early computer engineers, for instance. You know, I thought that was pretty interesting that, you know, this work you know, used to primarily be done by women, and it was seen through this gendered light, and it wasn't necessarily very highly compensated. Now, of course, it's primarily done by men, and now it has a much higher compensation. And so all of this, of course, is contributing to a concept that we've already discussed, the feminization of poverty. Women can work full time just like men, but oftentimes, especially if they're working in jobs that are dominated by women, those jobs aren't as well paying. And that increases the amount of women that are working but are poor, that are part of the working poor class. And then this chapter introduces the concept of the masculinization of wealth. If jobs held by men are better paid, then that allows them to do things with their money like invest, which increases their wealth, which leads to that wealth gap between men and women. But it isn't just the difference in how they're valued and how they're compensated. At least, when they're talking about the world of the 1960 flight attendant, stewardess, they are sexually objectified, they're harassed, they're held to standards that, are sexist and ageist and racist. Your book talks about, the weigh-ins. It talks about, the rules that they required regarding, not just weight, but hair, makeup, the fact that they were, supposed to respond to being sexually objectified and sexually harassed, that, they weren't expected to get upset about it. They weren't expected to chastise, the customer. And that was kind of the world of being a stewardess back then. And of course, lawsuits changed a lot of things. They talked about, once the Civil Rights Act was passed, it opened up the ability for the stewardess to do things like, to file lawsuits in regards to how they were treated, the discrimination they were facing. But then also, Celio Diaz was the first man to file a gender discrimination lawsuit, because, at some point they stopped hiring men to be stewards and flight attendants. And so he, sued for the right to be a flight attendant and to have male flight attendants. So of course, lawsuits are, an answer to this. But even when these types of policies and laws are in place, and, and this is why in previous chapters we've established we don't live in a patriarchy, we live in a modified patriarchy. Technically, we do have equal protection and equal rights under the law, but it is hard to enforce these laws. And a great example of this is the gender pay gap. So there are laws that require equal pay for equal work, but this has been really hard to enforce, just because, it isn't always clear, how people's pay is established. It isn't always clear, who is getting paid what. The Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed at the beginning of Obama's first term, that at least allowed people to be aware of what other people in their company, what other people in their position made. But being aware that you're making less isn't the same thing as your company being required to pay you an equal amount. And the last time that this type of legislation was in front of Congress, the Paycheck Fairness Act of 2014, it wasn't passed. And so we do have this pay gap, 82 cents to $1. And you can see that the gap, at one point it was shrinking, and then it kind of increased again, and then it's kind of largely held stable. And I give you a whole set of videos, largely funny, tongue-in-cheek videos, kind of making this point, that women are paid less than men, even when they're doing similar work, even when they're in similar positions. And that 82 cents to $1 is not true if you then start splitting women up by race. It's less if you're a Black woman. It's the lowest if you are a Latina. And so, let's just consider, what are the consequences of that wage gap, right? It impacts your ability, obviously, to spend money, but it impacts your ability to invest, to buy a home. It impacts your credit score and how, to what extent are you deemed credit worthy. It impacts your ability to get, loans, be them education loans or, whether it is a housing loan. It impacts, the size of your pension. It impacts how much Social Security you'll be eligible for when you retire. So it is important. That 18 cent on average is an important gap. It adds up. And, the gap itself varies like everything else. state by state. And you can kind of see that there's some states that are a little better. There's some states that are a little worse. And some of it also has to do with age. Younger people, if you have a state where most of your workers are younger, the gender gap is less. Probably because they have equal amounts of or more equal amounts of education and experience. If you have states where your labor force is older, then the gender pay gap increases.